Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Legals Questions and Answers. We are so fortunate to have my favorite real estate attorney, Don Lanson, partner at Manfredi Lavine. Lavine, right? So join us today. Now, I personally met Don years ago when I was his client, and I had a great experience. I mean, who likes to work with lawyers if they don't have to, right? But it was a great experience. And then I've always, in the past few years, thankfully I haven't had that too many real estate issues myself, but anyone that I know, I've always referred to his direction. And recently I have had real estate questions because of this pandemic that has affected all of us. And while we were talking, we realized maybe this information could be helpful for others. So Don, thank you so much for joining us today. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions, and the most questions we've been getting is issues related to landlord, tenant law, commercial, and residential real estate. So if you could just briefly introduce yourself and then just jump right into it, we could make the most of the time that we have together.
Sure. Thanks for having me. This is, I really like the opportunity to talk to people and tell them kind of what's going on, because there's so much misinformation out there. So it's great that you're doing this, and it's nice to actually be part of this process. And I love the view outside, actually, of your window. It looks really pretty.
And I apologize ahead of time if the roosters are crowing. So I am in the middle of nowhere in nature, but so beautiful to look at, sometimes not great to listen to.
I may have some chipmunks back that will do the same thing. But anyway, the landlord-tenant thing is just so sad and so unfortunate right now, because every state, city, county, whatever, are trying to enact rules to help. And the problem is they're all overlapping, and they're all kind of trying to create help, but it's actually creating inconsistencies. So a lot of tenants are desperate, especially right now, because there's certain aid, for instance, the $1,200 checks that people got, or the unemployment benefits, the additional $600 is due to expire at the end of this month. They may or may not issue another $1,200 check from the federal government. So a lot of people are worried about, do they have necessary funds to pay? Can the landlords evict? Can they not evict? Kind of what's going on. So there's so much stuff out there that I thought it'd be a really great chance of going through this, and hopefully everybody watching will get a little bit more clarity as to exactly what's going on in terms of what they can and can't do. Right now, there's in every state, by the way, there's various different discussions about eviction moratoriums. Specifically in California here, the governor has passed a very complicated and detailed one, essentially trying to say, don't evict anybody. Under the California law, it's till the end of September. That's what the governor has indicated. The difficulty being is that applies, by the way, for both residential and commercial. So every tenant basically in California is subject to these eviction moratorium rules. On top of that, every county and even the city that I'm in have passed its own eviction moratorium rules, trying to go along with what the state said and even provide some additional incentives. So for instance, there's a lot of businesses out there, if you have businesses watching, they may actually have city grants that are available if they're having problems. They can apply through their city for, I've heard $5,000 grants here in the city of Thousand Oaks that are available to businesses that are suffering. For people in terms of residential issues, there's a lot of different aid available to them. But the most important thing is every eviction moratorium basically has a few components. First, the landlord may not evict for a period of time. In fact, in the city of LA, they can't even serve a notice to evict, a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. That's a violation, just serving the notice by itself. The second component is a repayment schedule of some sort. That's where we get a little bit of a confusing thing, because some cities and counties will say, well, you have up to 1 year, but they don't say when it's supposed to be paid back. So is it, I have to pay, basically twice, 1 month for this month and then one of the back months at the same time? Or is there a $1,000 per month thing? So they're very unclear as to how that's supposed to be paid back. But again, those are the two basic concepts. Landlord cannot evict, and there has to be some repayment schedule, usually up to a year in terms of paying that back. Now, the legislatures for various different states, especially California, are trying desperately to try to pass something to solidify this. In fact, there's one proposal to have the federal government come back and pay up to 80% of the amount that's outstanding, as long as the landlord will basically waive the remaining balance. And then that tenant has to pay the federal government back over the next 10 years as to whatever it is they kicked in to try to satisfy the amount owed. That's actually being discussed as part of the California legislature. So there's a lot out there. Right now, nothing is passed. Nothing has been dealt with, because we're still trying to figure out where we are. This COVID thing, based on where you are, is either rising or it's flattening. It's not going down yet, especially in California. Luckily, I think in Hawaii, they're doing pretty good. I think they lifted the 14-day.
Not yet. It's now going till September, but then I think as of now, September, if you're coming from the mainland and that you show you took a COVID test 72 hours prior, they'll let you in. But I mean, I'm on Kauai and I think they have had 0 cases in the last, I don't know, knock on wood, like month and a half, but it's just because they're so strict. But then on the other hand, I mean, economically, it is, I mean, you see businesses going out of business, you see, because especially, they're so heavily reliant on tourism and you're not permitting them to come in. It's just, yeah, it's a very sad thing to see. I mean, I'm literally seeing businesses that I've been coming here for 10 years now that have been around and we've loved them. And I try to do my part and go support them. I try to, put on that mask and go support the local businesses, but unfortunately it's not enough. So yeah, but so in cases where you are having a dispute, let's say, for example, commercial, because I know a lot of small businesses are listening. So you aren't using your office space. Everyone's working remotely. You are not an essential business. You actually can easily work remotely. And your landlord, because I think a lot of what I'm getting is depends on who your landlord is. Some individuals, some companies, some corporations are very willing to speak with you and find a middle ground. Others aren't. And sometimes the bigger they are, obviously, whatever they do for you, they have to do for everybody else. And so it's almost like it's difficult to even get someone to come and sit at the table to discuss some sort of a package, something that they're going to agree on. What do you recommend if you're a small business and you're dealing with a landlord, you can't even get to discuss anything with you, but you're in a position where it's a hardship for you or that you want out of that lease and you just want to find a way to a middle ground to come out?
You've hit, I think, what is going to be the biggest problem for small businesses over the next 6 months or so, in that once even things start reopening a bit, is this realization of the limitations that you're talking about as to the ability to open. Like right now here in my area, bars can be open, but only if they sell food. If they don't sell food, they have to close. So then how do you deal with that? So first and foremost, for every commercial tenant and residential as well, the first place to always look is the Bible, which I call the lease. It's another phrase for it. That will specify what the rights and remedies of the parties are. And specifically, what a tenant needs to look at is if there's something in there that gives them the ability to either terminate or do something with regard to their obligation in the event of a problem like this. And I'll use a fun term that all lawyers like to throw out called force majeure, which we learn about in law school and then never ever use again because essentially, and that it's a clause without getting into the Greek, which is where it came from, is ultimately saying if there's an event that prevents you from taking advantage of the benefits under the lease, you can actually then terminate that lease. Some leases, business leases, contain that clause that would say in the event that I'm closed because of circumstances beyond what I have to deal with and what I caused, that doesn't allow me to actually be open, I should be allowed to exercise this provision to terminate the entire lease. And in fact, there's many legislative enactments to allow that provision to be inserted into leases, even if it's not there. One of the difficulties right now is under state and federal constitutions, there's actually amendments that say governments can't interfere with contracts. Oddly enough, that's exactly what they're doing by a lot of these eviction moratorium rules. But again, the concept being is look at your lease first and see if there's some clause that allow you to escape. If there's not, and by the way, most commercial leases do not have that because commercial landlord attorneys, like me, take them out because of this very situation. Then you're stuck in a situation where the best you can do is try to negotiate. And let me give you a really great thing for people watching in terms of maybe having pressure to the landlord to negotiate. So you're going to go to your landlord and say, look, I represent somebody in the Oaks Mall here locally, and the mall is closed now because they reinstituted the closure process. Help them go to the landlord and say, look, I can't open. I'm physically not able to. I know I don't have a clause in there that helps me. But right now, because of the eviction moratoriums and stuff, there's problems in terms of us actually making ends meet. And here's the key. On top of that, the entire state of California, every single court in the entire state will not accept any eviction paperwork for either a residential or commercial eviction. Yeah, no, please. This is one of the biggest parts that people don't get information about, is that the federal, the county, the cities, whatever, may pass whatever rules they want. The court system was so frustrated by trying to figure out exactly which rule to follow. They said, you know what? put all that aside. We're going to pass our own rule by something called the Judicial Council, which controls all of the courts. And they said, look, we're going to pass this easy rule. No court throughout the entire state will accept a complaint to evict somebody. They won't have a sheriff go out and kick anybody out. They won't do anything to try to evict either a commercial or residential tenant for 90 days after the governor lifts the state of emergency, whenever that happens to be. Now, right now, as I said before, the governor has extended the eviction moratorium under his rule to the end of September. So the earliest that he could issue an order lifting that state of emergency would be October, which means there will be no residential or commercial evictions in the state of California for the rest of this calendar year. So until January. So you, as a commercial tenant, can go to your landlord and say, so again, in a nice way, but here's the reality. I can be open now. I can make all of this business. I can continue doing stuff. I don't have to pay you rent. You can't come after me. You can't kick me out. And at the end of the day, I have an entity that if you want to sue the entity for breach of the lease, go ahead and knock yourself out. It's going to end up going bankrupt anyway. So either you work with me now, and by the way, how about a win-win? Maybe I'll agree to do some tenant improvements, or I'll agree to extend the lease, or I'll do something else to negotiate with you, and you give me a little bit more time, either wipe out the back rent or give me some repayment plan that actually I can work on.
Well, that's a great idea. I do have a question about individual state statutes. I know that if the force majeure clause, and forgive me if this is a silly question, but it's something that we've had come up. So if there's no clause, is there any relief that you can find in the actual state laws? Is there any law for, like, I don't know, going back to law school days, but like, what is it, commercial frustration, or, where you can't, something happens where the purpose of the contract no longer is valid or something like that? Are those types of legal arguments that you could fall back on, or if it's not in the contract, then no?
So great question. And this one issue that you just brought up is used in a lot of lawsuits right now, not necessarily because of eviction stuff, but actually because of insurance companies. A very famous restaurant, Musso and Frank, that's actually in Hollywood, was in once upon a time in America, in Hollywood and stuff like that, is suing its insurance company for this very reason, because it says that, look, under the terms of this process, we're closed, and the good faith and fair dealing inherent in the policy assumed that our business interruption process would kick in and we would actually get coverage. The insurance company is saying, no, you were closed not because of a pandemic. You were closed because of governmental action, which is different than the pandemic. Which again, most people will go, no, it was one and the same. But no, the insurance company is saying no, and because you don't have a clause in there that covers this one specific issue, we're not paying you any money for your business interruption. The problem right now is there's no legislative enactment right now that actually will allow somebody to take advantage of that if it's not in the document. There is legislative discussion, as I said before, about trying to require that be an implied term in every single contract, but it hasn't been passed yet because, shockingly, a lot of landlords and other entities are trying to fight that because they don't want that to become part of every contract, whether or not it's in the document or not.
So what I'm hearing is basically you should negotiate if you can, regardless if you're, tenant, landlord, or commercial, residential. If you can't, basically sit tight, because we really don't know how this is going to play out, what rules are going to come out, what regulations are going to come out. Even if the landlord, especially if it's a bigger company, corporation, which is what I've been hearing a lot of, is putting this pressure on you to we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Know your rights. They really can't do much until the end of the year at least. And maybe you could use that.
We even have situations now happening where certain banks, if they're government-backed loans, they can't foreclose right now because of federal limitations. That's expiring soon. But I have private lenders who are actually foreclosing on people and then threatening to evict them. And I'm telling those people, you can't be evicted. So the lender, the private lender, unfortunately decided to go ahead with foreclosure, not realizing the law on evictions and realizing now they're on the hook for paying property taxes and maintenance of the property when this tenant, who is now a tenant, used to be an owner, doesn't have to leave now for 6 months. So it's one of those things where no matter what the circumstances are, there is no evictions. That's not true. One circumstance that it's an exception, and that's if it's a matter of public health, whatever that means. So if you're running a meth lab out of your house, okay, yes, the law probably is going to allow.
You're running a meth lab for
right.
reasons other than this. You shouldn't be doing that.
But any other reason, I've even had, and just to give you an example, so I have a situation where I have a client that is a landlord of a property in Santa Monica, a very nice property. It's a very sensitive property near very sensitive environmental issues. And the tenant stopped paying the rent, also was not taking care of the environment and the surrounding areas, and was actually getting cited by the city for various violations in terms of that kind of process. I said, I think that's a sufficient public health issue. I wrote the letter saying, here, you're not following the rules. The COVID rules actually require that you provide evidence that you can't pay because of the COVID rules, and I don't think you can do that. So I pushed the issue. The tenant reported me to the district attorney. I actually got called in for questioning as to whether I was going to be arrested for pushing the issue as to trying to kick out a tenant during a pandemic. And finally explained to them, and they understood, but at the same point they said, there will be no evictions while this process is going on. So it's one of those things, both commercial and residential, there is nothing a landlord can do. In fact, in a lot of situations, I'm seeing landlords ignore tenants entirely, just figuring, you know what, either I'm not going to deal with you because I know you're not going to pay, or secondarily, is what you said, they're getting very aggressive and saying, we're going to sue you. Now, by the way, one important distinction, they can't evict you. Can they sue you for collection? Yes, they can. They can sue you for the back rent that may have been owed if they want to. Question is, why are they going to spend the time and money doing that?
Right. And is that something they could initiate now, or is it something that, like, another issue is if they like threaten, we're going to take you to collections. Is that something that they could do?
Yes, technically speaking, I've seen a lot of landlords can sue every month the amount comes due. They can sue in small claims if it's under $10,000 for that amount of the rent that's due that month, and file successive actions every single month if they wanted to. But again, the key is, even if they get a judgment for the money, they still can't kick the person out. So the question being is, it's still owed anyway. Why are you doing that?
Right. I have one other question on this, and that's a lot of people who are the landlords, let's say they're not the big companies or corporations, they're just an individual who acquired real estate as an investment and is renting it out. Those individuals still owe their mortgages on that property if they don't obviously own it outright, and they have the cost of maintenance there. Are they getting any relief?
That's a great, and that's one of the missed parts of this, and thanks for bringing it up. That's one of the missed parts, is that even though there's some help out there for tenants, there is really zero help for landlords. Right. Because keep in mind, the landlords aren't getting $1,200 checks. They're not getting the unemployment. They probably don't qualify for PPP because they don't have salary and payroll and stuff like that. So there's no programs. The only thing that they were getting benefited by was some of the banks, B of A, Wells Fargo, stuff like that, voluntarily agreed for a deferral of mortgages that I think for a few months. That expires literally at the end of this month. After that, landlords have a problem because the banks are looking at them and saying, look, for us to maintain our government guarantee of our Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac guarantee, you have to collect. If you don't, we lose our guarantee, which means all of a sudden it comes back on our books as a debt. We don't want that. So they're going to force, in fact, even in situations we'll start foreclosure proceedings because that landlord is not actually pursuing the tenant for rent. So it's a weird, vicious cycle where everybody's pointing at the other to say, hey, I'm a victim here, do something to help me. And really there's nothing that can be done for a lot of these people. So that's why I said landlord or tenant, you really need to try to find a way to work together in terms of a win-win as best you can while this is going on. Because otherwise, tenant, you're going to end up having a situation where if you stop paying, yes, they can't evict you, but it'll be, at some point you're going to owe a ton of money. They can get a judgment against you. The landlord has to pursue collections maybe at some point in order to maintain the loan without actually being in default. So it's a weird, vicious cycle that's very, very difficult back and forth.
Wow, but thank you so much, because I think there is a lot of, there's just unknowns because of the situation, and there's nothing anyone can do about that. But I also feel like this is a topic where everyone has an opinion about, but not a lot of that tends to be rooted in fact or the law or actually what's happening. So it's important for you to know. But I agree. I feel like, I don't know, when something like this happens, as a citizen, as an individual, as a member of a community, you have to have a sense of certain responsibility. And it's not as if, okay, well, COVID happened, so I don't have to do anything. I'm just going to let it slide. Like, pay what you can, do what you can, and really, be fair. That's the only way we're going to get through this, because if everyone's trying to take advantage of something, something's got to give. And if you don't see it directly today or in your foreseeable next 6 months, it's still going to come around and affect us as a society, as a country, as a state, as whatever you want to look at it, and it's going to affect everybody. So really keep that in mind.
It's funny, the recession we had 12 years ago, I probably did over 1,000 consultations with people who all of a sudden couldn't pay their mortgage, but were renting their property out, so it was on a rental. And while having these discussions, it was what I called the look in the mirror test, because I would have to give the advice of saying, can you not pay your mortgage and still collect the rent? At the time, yes, you could. That was legally allowed to be done. And again, I would half the people would go, my God, I would never do that. That's a horrible thing. And the other half would go, wow, that's fantastic. I'm getting my down payment back. So yeah, it's difficult, and and by the way, that brings up another thing in terms of negotiation. One of the most important parts of this is that yes, the contract says what you owe and stuff like that, but a lot of the times you can actually work out some termination agreement. For instance, say I have right now somebody in Beverly Hills got foreclosed on, and owes a lot of money back on this, and the landlord is very angry and says you need to leave by X date. I'm like, they're not leaving because they can't. They're actually type 2 diabetic. They're high risk. They're not going to be leaving. And they said, well, then I'm going to just wait and go after them. Like, look, how about a different situation? You want them out. They want to get out. They don't want to annoy you. How about a cash for keys type situation? And that's a slang term of saying, look, put aside all the contract terms and let's work out a normal thing. We're saying, look, they need moving expenses. They need a place to stay for a few months until they find something else. It's better for you to pay them, landlord, some money to get out, even though you don't owe it to them, and then get your place back quicker without drapes and toilets being stolen than it is for you to sit there and demand your rights and pound the desk and sit there and call and yell at me for the next 6 months. And by the same token, tenant, sometimes staying is great, but you might be better off by having them pay you something and then find something else.
That's great. Thank you so much, because that's very helpful. And like I said, it's a very difficult situation, but I think this is very helpful information to help people at least navigate within that difficulty. Now, the next topic is something that you described as something that is very interesting that not a lot of people know about, but that impacts everybody. So I'm very excited. It's telecommunication hardware, and then that's where I'm gonna have to turn it to you, because that's all I know, because I'm definitely one of those people about it.
So part of my other job, aside from being a real estate attorney, I'm actually the chair of the planning commission for the city of Thousand Oaks, and dealing with lots of different hardware issues. And by that, I mean the FCC is trying to implement the new 5G technology. And obviously all of us now are at home and using technology and internet and Wi-Fi a lot more than we used to. And that's becoming far more of an everyday occurrence. The difficulty is the hardware we have out there is very, very dated. A lot of, whether it's 3G, 4G, whatever the numbers, forget about what that means. But a lot of the stuff that's around, for instance, if you see the water tanks, and they usually have huge towers on the water tanks that actually are like metal, and they just kind of strap on. Or what I love is the really horrible fake looking palm tree that's really a cell tower array. Like, that's fooling anybody. But these things are very old technology, and what that is that they'll have these towers, say, that will go for 10 miles. Actually, the range of those are very long. But they're spotty, because ultimately that is only if in range if there's no mountains and hills and stuff like that. So like in my city alone, I think we have about 6 to 8 different 4G towers for 130,000 people. And sometimes that can get overloaded. Sometimes it doesn't reach enough people. We had a fire a year and a half ago, and a lot of people in North Ranch actually didn't get notice from the fire department to evacuate because the coverage was so bad. So with that, and because of the FCC wanting to get us into the next generation of various things, they've implemented a ton of new rules to help the Verizon and AT&T of the world to implement this new 5G process. And by the way, right now there is no such thing. Your phone may have it, but unless you're in a very few areas that have 5G hardware, it doesn't really exist yet. It's a concept. Even though, like I said on my phone, it'll say 5G or 5G with a plus on it. That means 5G asterisk, that it's coming soon. What 5G technology will be is very different than 4G. Instead of 6 to 8 towers in my city, we will have probably 15,000 of these relay stations. And what this relay tower will look like, it's a big crayon about 3 feet tall. It'll stick on every street light. It'll stick on every street lamp, probably dozens, if not hundreds of different commercial buildings. And these 5G relay stations only have a range of about 240 yards. So they're very short, and they don't go through buildings, they don't go through people. So you have to have them a ton of different places. And again, tens of thousands of them have to be installed within a city area to make sure you have the proper coverage. Because of that, the FCC has actually passed a bunch of rules limiting how much property owners can actually get as rent for these things. Right now, if you have a big billboard, in Aurora, there's a huge billboard that has a 4G tower on it, and they get paid a very nice amount of money. The FCC has said that any rental for these 5G relay stations is limited to $270 a year. That's it. And that's whether it's owned by a city, whether it's owned by a private party, whether it's a company, whatever it happens to be, because they want to make sure that we implement this process as efficiently as possible without creating too much of a cost for the telecommunication companies. Now that sounds, it can be great because that can mean you can download a movie within 3 seconds.
Oh, wow.
By the way, that's 5G. 6G is coming in 10 years, and that would be, you could download 142 movies in 1 second. that's the speed of it. So we can have quarantine really easily.
That's the thing. I think that's what's made me really realize how, I mean, it's just crazy how dependent you are. And being here on Kauai, obviously reception isn't that great at times. And even, I mean, even now it's like a very specific area that I have, and I'm lucky to be in a location where my landlord here has amazing internet situated. Because I said, this is what I really need more than anything else. I love the view. I love being here, but I got to work. I'm up at 6 every morning. I got to work. But how dependent we are on everything. I mean, literally just everything from it's from our just workouts to a recipe to just everything, like communicating with one another, saying, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's a little scary because if anything goes wrong, you know, but that's great to know that's gonna be a huge help. So when
and then there's the downside.
Oh, okay. Well, of course there is. I said, what's the timeline? But of course, there's also a downside. There's never anything.
So the timeline, it was supposed to start being put in this year. Obviously, there are certain things that kind of may hinder that by virtue of the pandemic. But I imagine, you know, it's starting to be in Santa Monica. If you drive around and see, again, at the tops of streetlights, you'll see these weird looking crayon things. You look and go, wow, that's Big Brother filming me. No, it's not. That's actually the small cell tower relay station, just trying to make sure.
In a place we can't see, you know, they're filming, but we can't. No, just kidding.
Right. So I would say over the next few years, depending upon the area, but it's a huge push to try to get this done, because once they can do that, and by the way, secondarily for residential property owners, the telecommunication companies don't want to come in your house anymore. They don't want to worry about your wiring. They don't want to sit there and get bitten by your dog. They don't want to deal with, you know, whatever you want to, you know, serve them as a snack. They want to have everything available to them. So what they're going to do is put one of these relay stations every 3 or 4 houses out on the street in a huge black box that they can actually then access the relay station and all of the wiring in your house. So everything in your house would be wireless. They would never have to actually come in your house. Now this box looks like probably a 5-foot tall coffin. So they might try to decorate it up because it's a big black box at the moment, which doesn't look really good. But again, that's the future of this process, is everything is going to be wireless. Everything is going to be these relay stations that allow technology to increase exponentially. The difficulty is, a lot of people get concerned, is we have more radiation by virtue of a lot of these towers. You know, I've had lots of people come before me in the Planning Commission concerned about electromagnetic sensitivity. In terms of the fact that they get headaches, they get nausea, they get lots of different problems because of the increased radiation.
About that. Yeah, because that's a very, very, it's a very real issue. Do they know what, I mean, obviously I don't know how open they would be about it, but about in terms of the health effects and the negative impact that it could have?
So this is where the federal government kind of steps in and says, we have determined, this is the FCC, we have determined this is within acceptable ranges, therefore it's not an issue. So like on the Planning Commission, if a cell tower comes before me, all I can evaluate is its aesthetics, meaning if it looks ugly, I can require trees to put up in front of it. I cannot, as a matter of federal law, evaluate the health impacts of whether or not it might hurt people, because they don't want cities, counties, or states to even have any involvement in trying to limit the expansion of this concept. They've said, in their opinion, after lots of different studies, that there is no long-term effect from electromagnetic sensitivity or range. There are some people that are concerned and say it hasn't been tested enough, and they point out what I always hear, well, cigarettes were good for you 70 years ago. I get that. I have not seen so far a report I would legitimately rely upon in saying that it does cause a permanent health effect, but again, it's one of those things where it's out of my hands even if I did, because again, the federal government is pushing it.
Individuals within a certain area don't want it, and that's not something that would be able to impact whether or not.
No, it's one of those things. I've had even somebody argue ADA, American with Disabilities Act, saying, look, you're preventing me from living in my own house now by virtue of this issue. And the federal government said, too bad. We take precedent. We can pass those rules, and They are beyond you contesting them. And in fact, it's been challenged in courts. And unfortunately for those people, the court system has no choice but to, under the supremacy clause, allow that federal government action to go forward. If you don't like it, they say, report to your federal congressperson and get the law changed to make the FCC change it. But as it is now, there's really nothing can be done about the health impacts.
There's so much going on in our, I mean, obviously the pandemic is just the latest reminder. There's just so much going on in our environments, in our world, things that we see, we don't see, the knowns, the unknowns that affect us every day. And I don't know, I'm a very much more of a planner type A, always like to know what's going on and in control. But I feel like one of the, it was a tough lesson, but a good lesson I'm learning in these last few months is you just really, you really are not in control of this vehicle. You just need to take care of you, buckle in, sit, and then hope for the best. I mean, honestly, there's just so much going on, but I don't know. It's a world that is rapidly changing, and sometimes I think it puts us in a position as humans where we're more reacting to our environment versus being, a part of that in a lot of ways, just because so much of the change is outside of our control. But thank you. I had no idea when I was like looking at the I was like, wow, yeah, that sounds exciting. That sounds good.
Or not. Most people go, that doesn't sound exciting at all, until all of a sudden they say, yes, you're gonna have one on your house that you can't stop them from putting on your house, and they're gonna pay you a grand total of $270 a year.
That's yeah. I mean, when I say exciting, that's exactly the direction I meant.
and again, you said it actually. There's so much stuff going on. I mean, I'm assuming right now Apple is going to come out soon with its augmented reality glasses that will allow us to have on our phones and have pictures of where we're going while we're walking. I mean, all of that requires so much data and so much information that there's no way to do it without actually improving the infrastructure. And that's kind of, as I said, it's a big machine that most of us have nothing to do with. So all we can do is basically make sure we understand what it is, and then hopefully adapt in the event we have an issue. So if you have an issue with electromagnetic energy, you're probably going to have to move to an area that doesn't have as many of these kinds of relay stations.
I mean, I don't know what the situation in Kauai looks like, but I got to tell you, more and more, I'm thinking of just having an office here, taking the Hawaii bar, and just, I don't know. Do you know if it's hard, if it's a tough bar? I feel like thinking about it a little bit. I don't know. I've never heard anything. I'm going to do some research. I have some attorney friends out here, so.
I think the only Hawaiian bar I'm familiar with is the one that serves, Mai Tais, but that's a different.
Well, I'm the master of that bar. Okay, so our next, another issue that I wasn't very familiar with, but I was reading about it, and it's very interesting for people who have this as an option for accessory dwelling units and the regulations that are changing with the state revised laws regarding that. If you could explain a little bit, because I know.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's kind of like the telecommunication thing. And at first glance, you go, really? Why is that a big deal? But the reality is this could be absolutely huge, because what it means is throughout the state of California, there is no more such thing as single family homes. Every single property can have a multi-unit structure, even if it's within the actual house. You're just converting a garage into a rental unit. So literally, there is no more single family homes throughout the entire state of California. And I think that's going to be happening lots of different places for a few reasons. One is we have kids that have nowhere to go, and we want to give them a separate unit, but at the same point, we want to actually make sure that they have some place to live. So I think kids are looking at a lot more now in terms of more density, living in an environment that actually doesn't allow them or doesn't need them to drive. So you're going to see a lot of areas that are like LA is a perfect situation. Brentwood, you can actually convert a lot of your garages or a lot of your attics or even basements, whatever, even have a separate structure where all of a sudden you have a separate rentable unit that you can make income on. This person then can walk to work, and it can be a much better issue in terms of trying to allow more housing. That's the big problem right now is there's so much of a problem with lack of housing, and that's by design. A lot of our state, and by the way, Hawaii as well, has intentionally tried to slow down development. They don't want, and Airbnbs, they don't want more development, because once you live in a city, you say, fine, and now I'm here, I'm done. I don't want anybody else living here. And you try to cap that involvement. The problem is that states, looking at tax revenue and other things, require it. So like, for instance, the state of California for the next 7 years is requiring that my city of 130,000 people come up with, I think it's 3,000 more housing units, which doesn't sound like a lot, except for the fact, if you look back the past 7 years, we've added a total of 500 in 7 years.
I'm familiar with your area, but that is, I mean,
So Ventura County as a whole, I think, has to come up with 28,000 housing units within the next 7 years. Again, realizing this point, there has to be some involvement of allowing more housing units. So, and here's the other part is there's no new places to build. There's no more building out to the Palmdales and the Lancasters. I mean, those are all, every place is built out. There is no more free land unless you change zoning of agriculture. The same thing in Hawaii, but there's no more places to build anymore. So now we're stuck with either infill, which take existing structures and convert them in some way, which is going to happen with, like, for instance, malls. I think a lot of big malls are going to be converted into multi-use, where they'll have residential on top and commercial on the bottom, because at this point, a lot of commercial is going to end up dying because of the fact of how these things are going. But on top of that, allowing people in their houses to then convert them into rentable units in some way is going to be a huge push. And there's a lot, and I think I have so many rules that I'm not going to sit there and bombard you with all these, but the main thing ultimately is you can have a second or a accessory dwelling, an ADU, on every single property in the state. Again, whether you convert your attic, your basement, a garage, whatever it happens to be, that is allowed, and every city must allow it. The state has made it clear that no city can deny a person the right to do that, which is a huge thing. And by the way, you don't need to live there. You actually can have a main unit, and you can have a rental unit, and you don't have to live in either of them. That's a huge thing, because
this is passed already, or this is in, oh, wow.
This is California state law is already passed. So every city, including mine, had to kind of catch up and pass rules to basically, comply and mimic those. We don't like it. Most of the cities don't like it because it forces them to allow a lot of density in areas that they may not necessarily prefer.
Now, I have a silly question, but so is this any type of housing unit, or is it just for single family homes that can be converted, or is it any kind? If it's a townhouse, or if, let's say, you're in a community, can the community put restrictions that doesn't allow you to bring in a tenant or convert anything?
You asked a great question. That's exactly the perfect question to ask. So because of that, and it's a long answer, I'll try to make it short, but because of the huge nature of that issue and forcing people to allow it, a lot of HOAs are not happy. A lot of the homeowner associations try to prevent it and try to fight it. And there's actually a rule as part of the rules that says an HOA, if they try to block it, it's invalid. So it actually says you cannot HOA, you cannot stop them from having it. Now, with that said, HOAs can still have an involvement in terms of aesthetics. If you have a nice Tuscan thing, they don't want you to put up a metal shed. So it's got to fit within their landscaping and aesthetic guidelines. But again, they can't prevent it. Lots of cities and other counties try to also limit it in other ways, but again, they're not supposed to. The key concept ultimately is they want to make sure that you're allowed to have some basic separate rentable unit if you want to. Again, we always talk about granny flat. That's kind of the mentality. They want to make sure that seniors have someplace to go, so they're not forced to stay in their homes, especially to the extent that they're in I know many people out here are in 4-bedroom homes, and it's just them because their spouse has passed away and they're in their 80s. Why are they keeping it? Well, they're keeping it because they can't find another house. And they're landlocked because they can't buy anything else because it's too expensive. So it's really trying to advocate this use of land in a way that actually then kind of moves us into the next generation, hopefully, of allowing properties to open up by giving people a chance of then renting it out. It's kind of like the Uber thing as well. It's also allowing you another source of income when you may not have it, especially given hard times if people have been laid off and furloughed and stuff like that.
People are looking for alternative options. And then just one other question. For this type of thing, if someone were interested in doing it, how would they go about understanding what the standards would be of this other, like if I'm converting my garage, it has to, I'm sure, live up to a certain amount of standards if I'm going to be renting it out and let someone to live there. How can they make sure that they are providing a safe environment that's acceptable for someone to rent it out to?
So a few questions there as part of that. Initially is how do they find out how they do that? So every city, their website will usually have a page that it's dedicated to this issue. Every city in Ventura County does. And I know I've seen the one in LA, I've seen the one all over. So most have done this because what also the rules have provided is it used to be cities, and I'm not saying that anybody would do this negatively, but as a way to minimize the availability of this, they charged a very high fee. So again, if you want to stop something, tax it. That's usually an easy way to do that. And the state said no. They actually have a maximum amount of the fee you can charge. And again, that all has to be listed as part of the planning. And so if you go to a city website and find the planning department, usually that page will have some kind of link to ADUs and exactly what's the process of an application and what you have to submit and stuff like that. Now, by the way, the key also for this is once you do this application process, it's what's called stamped at the counter, which means that it's no different than a building permit. So it's no different than you wanting to, build a barbecue outside. It's just like any other building permit, and you don't need your neighbor's signature. You don't need their approval. You don't even need to tell them. It's great for lawyers because we all of a sudden create this angst.
Honestly, this is fascinating. I was going to ask, are you guys hiring? Because I'm in my area of practice. This is just fabulous. This is like great. It's interesting. I always used to think went right out of law school, I did real estate law. I actually, my uncle, so I worked a little bit for their law firm, for their development company. And then I went and did, I was an associate for a smaller real estate law firm that represented a lot of HOAs, and we did a lot of like governing docs and stuff like that. So I think I had a totally different experience. So whenever I would hear real estate law, I would just say, well, I don't know. I had CCNRs like come into my brain and I would freak out, and but this is fascinating. I gotta tell you, I'm going to be sending you a little job application. I'm going to send you my resume.
Yeah, you'd have to leave Hawaii though. That's the only downside.
We're going to talk about Hawaii. I think maybe I need to, they have real estate issues here. I think it's easier if I take the Hawaii bar.
There is, and I haven't even gotten to the most entertaining part of real estate law, which is neighbor disputes, which wasn't on the list here, but I so much enjoy the neighbor dispute issue. And I actually do lectures on this one. And my favorite is the Justin Bieber egg incident. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
So in Calabasas, Justin Bieber at some point was not happy with the neighbor and decided to go egg the neighbor's house. The problem is that Justin Bieber's own cameras picked up him egging the neighbor's house, at which point they called it in. And I think it was literally the SWAT teams. I think there were helicopters and tanks brought in to deal with this issue. So yeah, real estate can be a lot more drama.
Well, I'm fascinated. Okay, so our last topic, which is an incredibly important one, because again, I'm telling you, I learned more reviewing the topics for a really long time, which has been great, is we have, an election coming up, and with election, in addition to all the drama that goes with electing our officials, there are important ballot initiatives that people often just don't take the time to understand, but some of these can have very, 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 very large impact on our communities and our state. And so please review them, because I honestly wasn't aware of a lot of them and the impact that it's going to have. And if you could describe them a little bit, and then also maybe the pro and the con of it, just so that people can be, not that you make your own decision and you're voting, but just so you understand,
right.
you know?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I don't know about you, but I normally review these ballot initiatives when they come out in November, and usually there's like 15 of them. And I'm like looking at this going, I barely understand these. I don't know how they write these.
That's what I'm saying, is I have to literally like spend time understanding, reviewing. And that's why this is a great opportunity for someone who actually knows it to explain the real effect that it would have, both good and bad.
So there's a bunch of them on the ballot that are weird. Can 17-year-olds vote? Do we want to let Uber people be independent contractors? There's lots of those ones, but the ones for real estate that are going to be huge, in my opinion. First is Prop 15, which is called a split roll, which doesn't mean anything to anybody. What essentially it means, though, is right now there's a fun thing in California called Prop 13 that dates back to the 1970s. And essentially it said that when you buy your property tax is fixed based on what your purchase price was. And then they can only raise it 2% per year from that day forward. So for most of us, if we bought our property, decades ago, that's a great thing, because it basically limits our property tax increase. The difficulty is in looking at some property owners, like for instance, Disneyland. They bought their property back in the 1950s and are probably paying less in property taxes than you are because of the fact of what that limitation is. So the split roll Prop 15 looks to basically exempt commercial property of $3 million or more from the limitations or the protections of Prop 13. So if you're a landowner, especially a commercial property owner specifically, and your property is worth $4 million, if this passes, your property will be reassessed every year based on its current market value, and you will have to pay property taxes based on that number, irrespective of whatever you purchased it for. So if you bought it for, if it's $3 million or less, then you should be fine and exempted, at least by this one initiative. A lot of people will say, well, that's so few properties. Well, I'm sorry, in this area, that's almost every single commercial property.
And I feel like, I mean, from the numbers and given the situation that we're in, that's also something that could put people out of business. I mean, realistically, if you're not anticipating that level of, well, I guess it depends on when they acquired it. I mean, just saying right now with everything happening, a change like that.
Well, it comes back to one of your initial concerns about commercial tenants, because there was an article in the LA Times, and I think it was an op-ed, I'm not sure, that said, essentially, this is a great idea and this will barely affect anybody. And then the problem, though, is this writer didn't think ahead to realize that most commercial leases, not most, a lot of them are what's called triple net leases, which means that the ultimate tenant pays insurance, taxes, all the different maintenance with regard to the property. So if there's a property tax increase on a commercial property, guess who's ultimately going to pay it?
Yeah.
Probably going to be the tenant. The tenant who all of a sudden already can't make their rent, is dealing with all the different issues in terms of all the problems for COVID and closures and whatever. All of a sudden now their landlord's going to say, hey, my property tax just got increased by half. Have a nice day. You got to pay it. Well, that creates more problems with those tenants maybe not being able to pay it and leaving. I mean, it's a negative for those tenants. Now, again, you said both sides. The money is going to go to education. The money right now is dedicated, in the event it passes, it would go towards education, which is hugely underfunded. In fact, right now, one of the biggest problems we have is because of the tax revenue loss that California has. We were $41 billion lower in tax revenue collection. A lot of schools now are going to suffer huge problems, especially now with people not maybe sending their kids to school. That's more revenue loss. And that's such a huge loss right now that I can understand where people say, hey, this is not fair for Disneyland to pay a fraction of what it should be paying, and other huge commercial property owners. They should actually have to sit there and support their fair share. And by the way, that same argument would go towards probably other properties. If you own a $20 million Malibu mansion at some point, people are going to say, why is it you're paying less in property taxes than I do on my house in Oxnard? That's not very fair.
I wish it was a bit of especially with the timing of everything, if it was something that was a little bit more of a middle ground, not what you were, plus the minimal increases over the years, not what it's worth today, but something in the middle. And I mean, education, the note on that is just, I think I'm hoping one of the positive things that will come out of this pandemic is a greater appreciation for the education system, the roles our teachers play in the lives of our kids, and hopefully we will find in the budget ways of supporting them. I mean, obviously through I'm an idealist, so I don't know, but
you know what, you should be. In fact, if everybody's watching, one of the parts of the $1 trillion next level of the bailout that the federal government is thinking about is a lot of that money hopefully would then go to states and cities to actually supplement educational losses by virtue of the fact that the pandemic has made them lose a lot of revenue.
Right.
So it's all interconnected. So I see both points. In fact, by the way, the governor has been pushed to actually push this as an executive order, not even wait for the election in November, to actually pass this as an executive order now to try to make up the difference, because we had such a shortfall. And for your viewers here, there's a California statute that actually said, or constitutional amendment that says that the Congress has to pass a balanced budget or else they don't get paid. So they assumed that money would come in from the federal government on this new package that's being discussed. If it doesn't, I don't know where we make it up. So that's going to be a huge part of it.
Right. And then let's see, there was Prop 19, senior.
Right. This is another attempt to try to affect behavior. So right now, if you're over 55 and you want to move, you can take at one time, you can take your property tax base to your next property if it's equal or lesser value. So you say you bought it 30 years ago, your property tax is going to be pretty low. Right. If you go buy another property now that is going to be equal or lesser value, it increased 10 times in terms of its value. But your property tax will still be what you were paying before for this one time. And here's the other key: only in 11 counties of the 58 in the state, only 11 counties allow this. Mm-hmm. All the other counties say, no, we're not going to give you that protection. So this initiative, it's Prop 19, would allow seniors to do that throughout the state, would also allow you to do it more than once, and also wouldn't matter as to how much the replacement property you were buying, because right now it has to be equal or lesser. So this is a huge attempt to try to motivate seniors to move. And again, it's funny because it's usually downsized, but again, replacement properties are possibly more expensive now because of the way the economy is. So allow them to move throughout the state, carry that property tax over, opening up property to other young families or whatever to end up buying, and then not making them in a situation where their income or their expense would be any greater. So that's a benefit. Now, the negative is, as you said, both sides. A lot of people believe this is a rich person's benefit, that ultimately the only people who are going to take advantage of this are successful rich people who already can afford to pay more in property taxes anyway. And why are we giving them a benefit when in fact ultimately they should be supporting more of the tax burden for the society than they are now? Because by the way, a lot of seniors don't exactly spend a lot of money on a lot of different local businesses. That's why a lot of the problems, like for instance, here in Thousand Oaks, we're 38%, I think, over 55. Which is great, that's fine, but they don't necessarily go to a lot of the different shops and restaurants as much as the younger people do. So we're getting a situation where we actually want to have a different groups of all different age groups as part of the community, not just getting a geriatric group, because ultimately then we lose a lot of the support of the businesses that are part of the community.
Wow, there's so much. I've always, since I was very young, I've always wanted to go into politics. And as I've gone, I still do, but it's just, I don't know how.
Well, it's tough too, because, and this is one of the things I come back and, like, for instance, you said support small business. So many times we look and say, look, right now cities get money from the sales tax. That's how it's generated. If we're not getting enough money to support these small businesses, the government has to make it up somewhere. We have to pay for utilities. I'm speaking now government-wise. We have to make that up, and if we don't get it from one way, we have to then raise property taxes, raise sales taxes, raise other things to actually make ends meet. That's why it kind of gets things out of equilibrium. So supporting your local business at the end of the day is actually supporting yourself, because then it's lower taxes you have to pay on the back end.
I'm a huge supporter of local businesses on a number of levels. I will continue to do my part for my community always.
Nice. And then the last one is a weird one that most people, again, may not realize that is far more involved. So there's something called rent control, which will be Prop 21. Everybody's going, well, why do I care about rent control? Well, right now there are various cities that have had rent control for a long time. Santa Monica is the most obvious one, and it's very strict in saying that ultimately once you rent a place, even if you have a year term, at the end of that year, you can't be forced to leave unless you do certain things, meaning you don't pay the rent or you commit some other breach. Beyond that, you can stay as long as you want without, and I've had people in Santa Monica stay decades. In fact, I was helping some the other day, they're on the beach. I think half a block from the beach, they're paying $350 on their rent of a place that's probably worth $7,000 a month, because they've lived there for decades. Well, last year, January 1st of this year, the state actually passed its own rent control ordinance, far weaker than Santa Monica's. It does allow you to stay as long as you want. And if the landlord has to kick you out, though, they only have to pay you 1 month's rent, which is a very small amount. In Santa Monica and other places, if the landlord tries to kick you out, they have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to actually compensate you for that. So this new initiative is actually going to make the Santa Monica concept more evolved around the state, a lot more strict in terms of giving tenants rights to not be pushed out, give rights to not have their rent increase more than a certain percentage. A lot more of those rights, which again is another way the landlords will say, hey, this is not giving me a chance of making a living. This is making it impossible between, the rent control, between taxes, between all this other stuff like that. Doesn't pay to be a landlord anymore. Now with that guard, tenants are saying, right now you have all the cards. We can't rent any place. You control everything. In fact, a lot of times landlords will say, you know what, I'm just going to take the whole property off the market and sell those condos. And all of a sudden, all those people are displaced and they have nowhere to go. In fact, the number of rental units available, people would think is increasing. It's not. It's not going up enough to actually satisfy the demand of all the people we have looking for rental space. So it's a weird dichotomy of trying to help, but at the same point, it creates probably a lot more issues than people realize.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm going to have to go into real estate law, it seems like. Well, Don, thank you so much. This was such great and helpful information. And we are going to put your information, your contact information, I mean, your firm's contact information, not your personal information, on our post, because I'm sure people may have additional questions or need for guidance, and they would want to speak with you. But I just really want to say thank you. You are it's been a pleasure. And I was just, before we went and started recording, I was saying how I've known you for years, and you've helped me in a mess a few years ago, which is how we met. But this is the first time I get to see you in person, and it's I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for all the great information you gave, all the help you give to the community, and all the things that you do, both in your capacity as an attorney, but also for your city. And thank you. And my takeaway is know your rights, read what you sign, because even as a lawyer, I don't always, as carefully as I should, read everything and understand what you're getting into, whether you're the landlord, whether you're the tenant, whatever agreement, because there will be that rainy day or a pandemic day that we never saw coming. But thank you.
You got to know the rights you have before you argue them. But and thanks for having me. This is awesome for you to do this, and hopefully your viewers got some good information.
I'm sure they will. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. And I will hopefully connect with you again soon.
You got it.